For more than 1,000 years, a book vanished from the world. It was quoted by an apostle in the New Testament. It was read in the earliest Christian communities, and then it disappeared so completely that most of the Western world forgot it ever existed. When it resurfaced, it did not come back through a library in Rome or a monastery in Jerusalem. It came back from the highlands of Ethiopia, carried out by a Scottish explorer who had gone looking for the source of the Nile and found something far stranger instead. Inside its pages was a description of a throne room no human being was supposed to survive looking at, a rebellion of angels who broke the boundary between heaven and earth, and a warning about what happens when knowledge falls into the wrong hands. This is the Book of Enoch, and before we go any further, it is worth being honest about what it actually says, because the real content is stranger, older, and more revealing than most of what gets repeated about it online. Let's clear something up immediately, because it matters for everything that follows. Nowhere in the Book of Enoch does anyone claim to have discovered who created God, and nowhere does the text claim to finally show you what God literally looks like. That framing gets attached to this book constantly because it drives clicks, but it misrepresents the actual document. What the Book of Enoch does contain is one of the most vivid, most influential visions of the divine throne room in all of ancient literature, a vision so powerful that it directly shaped how the authors of the biblical book of Daniel, the book of Revelation, and much of later Jewish and Christian mysticism imagined heaven itself. The truth doesn't need exaggeration. It's compelling enough on its own. So who was Enoch, and why does an entire tradition of literature carry his name? In the book of Genesis, Enoch appears in a single short passage, the great-grandfather of Noah, seventh in line from Adam. Genesis says almost nothing about him except one striking detail. He walked with God, and then he was not, because God took him. That's it. No death is recorded. In a genealogy full of men who lived and died, Enoch simply leaves the story without dying. For ancient readers steeped in a culture that took every word of Scripture seriously, that silence was an invitation. If Enoch didn't die like everyone else, where did he go? What did he see there? Over the centuries, that unanswered question became the seed for an entire body of writing attributed to him, texts in which Enoch is taken up into heaven, shown the secrets of the cosmos, and sent back to earth to warn humanity about what he witnessed. The text most people mean when they say the Book of Enoch is what scholars call First Enoch, or the Ethiopic Book of Enoch, because the only complete surviving version comes down to us in the ancient Ethiopic language known as Ge'ez. It isn't a single unified composition written by one author at one moment in history. It's a collection assembled over roughly 2 centuries, from around 300 BCE up through the turn of the era, stitched together from at least 5 distinct sections that were likely written by different scribes at different times and later combined into the book we now read as one continuous work. That matters because it means the Book of Enoch isn't a single ancient conspiracy document smuggled out of history. It's closer to an anthology, a library of Jewish apocalyptic thought from the centuries just before and during the rise of the Dead Sea Scrolls community, reflecting real theological currents that were alive in that world. For a long time, scholars in the West genuinely didn't know how old this book was. Some 19th century researchers even argued it might be a Christian composition from centuries after Jesus, dressed up to look ancient. That question wasn't settled through speculation. It was settled through archaeology. In 1947, shepherds discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls in caves near Qumran, and among the thousands of fragments pulled from those caves over the following years were pieces of Enoch, written in Aramaic, the everyday language of Jesus' own time and earlier. 11 separate Aramaic manuscripts of the Enoch material turned up at Qumran, covering roughly 1/5 of the full Ethiopic text. That discovery ended the debate. These fragments have been dated as far back as the 3rd century BCE, physical proof that Enoch was already circulating and being copied by Jewish scribes long before Christianity existed. Interestingly, one major section of the book, known as the parables or similitudes of Enoch, was completely absent from the Qumran caves, which has led scholars to suspect that section developed later, and possibly in a different community than the rest of the collection. The book itself breaks into 5 parts, and understanding what each one actually contains is the difference between knowing this text and just repeating rumors about it. The first section, called the Book of the Watchers, covers roughly the opening third of the work and tells the story most people associate with Enoch, the fall of a group of angels called the Watchers. This section draws on a brief cryptic passage from Genesis chapter 6, which says that the sons of God saw the daughters of men and took wives from among them, producing offspring called the Nephilim. Genesis gives you 2 sentences and moves on. The Book of Enoch takes that fragment and builds an entire mythology around it. 200 angels, led by a figure named Semjaza, descend to a mountain identified as Hermon and bind themselves by oath to take human wives. Another leader among them, Azazel, is singled out for a different crime, teaching humanity forbidden knowledge, including how to forge weapons of war, how to work metal into swords and shields, and how to use cosmetics and adornment to seduce. Other watchers teach sorcery, astrology, and the reading of omens. The result of this contact between angels and human women is a race of giants, the Nephilim, who grow monstrous in appetite and violence, consuming everything humanity produces and then turning on humanity itself. The consequences described in this section are severe and specific. God dispatches the archangels to deal with the crisis. Uriel is sent to warn Noah of the coming flood. Raphael is ordered to bind Azazel, wrap him in darkness, and cast him into a pit in the desert until the day of judgment. Gabriel is tasked with turning the giants against one another so they destroy themselves in war. Michael is commanded to bind Simjaza and the other watchers who mated with human women, imprisoning them beneath the earth for 70 generations until the final judgment. The flood, in this telling, isn't only a punishment for generic human wickedness, the way it's often summarized from Genesis alone. It's presented as a direct response to a cosmic transgression, a way of cleansing the earth of a hybrid race that was never supposed to exist. The list of watchers named in this section is longer than most summaries suggest, and the specificity is part of what makes this text so unusual for its time. Beyond Simjaza and Azazel, the book names figures like Kokabel, associated with teaching the signs of the stars, Armoros, linked to the resolving of enchantments, and Shamsiel and Sariel, tied to solar and lunar signs and the courses of the moon. Each one is credited with handing humanity a specific piece of forbidden expertise, whether that's metallurgy, cosmetics, incantations, or the reading of celestial omens. The effect is less like a single dramatic fall and more like a systematic corruption of an entire civilization's knowledge base, technology, beauty, and prophecy, all traced back to the same illicit source. It's worth noting the parallel this creates with the biblical scapegoat ritual described in Leviticus, where a goat bearing the sins of the community is sent out into the wilderness to a place called Azazel. Scholars have long debated whether that Levitical name refers to the same figure punished in Enoch, or whether the Enoch tradition borrowed and reinterpreted an older ritual term, but the overlap is too close to be coincidental, and it shows how deeply interconnected these traditions really were. It's in this same section of the book that Enoch has his famous ascent into heaven, and this is the part worth slowing down on because it's the closest the text comes to describing anything about God directly, and it's almost the opposite of what clickbait titles claim. In chapter 14, Enoch describes being lifted up by clouds, mist, wind, and lightning, carried past a wall built of hailstones ringed with flame until he reaches a great house. He enters it trembling, describing a structure that is somehow both blazing hot and freezing cold at once. Its floor made of fire, its ceiling flickering with lightning and the paths of stars. Beyond that first chamber lies a second, even larger and more magnificent than the first, one Enoch says he cannot adequately put into words. Inside it stands a towering throne. Its appearance, he writes, was like crystal, or in some translations like ice, surrounded by wheels shining like the sun, with the sound of cherubim around it. Streams of fire pour out from beneath the throne, so intense Enoch says he cannot look directly at them. And then Enoch describes the figure seated on the throne, referred to as the Great Glory, whose robe shines brighter than the sun and is whiter than any snow that has ever fallen. And here is the line that actually matters, the line that directly contradicts the idea that this book reveals what God looks like. No angel could enter that inner chamber and look upon his face because of the sheer magnificence and glory surrounding him, and no flesh could behold him at all. 10,000 times 10,000 stand before the throne, and even they cannot draw near. The text isn't handing you a physical description of a face or body. It's doing something almost the opposite. It is emphasizing, in the strongest terms the author could summon, that this being is fundamentally beyond direct human perception. This scene didn't come out of nowhere. It echoes earlier biblical throne visions, like the prophet Micaiah's vision in the Book of Kings, and Ezekiel's vision of wheels and living creatures, and it would go on to directly influence the throne room scene in the New Testament Book of Revelation, where a seer is caught up into heaven and sees a throne surrounded by lightning, thunder, and a sea of glass like crystal. Enoch's vision sits inside a much older and longer tradition of Jewish throne mysticism, not as some hidden secret finally exposed, but as one of its most important surviving witnesses. After this vision, Enoch is given a mission. He's sent to confront the fallen watchers and deliver their judgment. Their pleas for mercy will not be granted. They will never again ascend to heaven, and they are bound to the earth until the end of days. Enoch then takes several cosmic journeys guided by angels, touring the ends of the earth, the storehouses of the winds, the resting places of the stars, and the places prepared for the punishment of the wicked and the reward of the righteous after death. These journeys read almost like an ancient traveler's map of the unseen world, blending geography, astronomy, and moral judgment into a single unified picture of the universe. One particularly striking passage describes 4 separate hollow chambers set aside within a mountain in the west, holding the spirits of the dead until the day of judgment, one for the righteous, marked by a bright spring of water, one for ordinary sinners who have not yet faced punishment, and 2 more reserved for the specific categories of the murdered, whose spirits cry out for justice, and for those guilty of the worst crimes, who are separated entirely and denied even the possibility of resurrection alongside the righteous. This is one of the earliest surviving Jewish texts to describe the afterlife with this level of structural detail, sorting souls into distinct compartments based on the nature of their lives and deaths, rather than treating the realm of the dead as a single, undifferentiated shadow world. And it represents a meaningful step in the development of ideas about heaven, judgment, and resurrection that would later surface throughout the New Testament. The second major section of the book, called the Book of Parables, or the Similitudes of Enoch, covers chapters 37 through 71, and this is arguably the most theologically significant part of the entire collection, because it introduces a figure called the Son of Man, also referred to as the Chosen One or the Righteous One, a pre-existent hidden figure who will sit in judgment over kings and the mighty on the last day, and who will be revealed to the righteous and the elect. This concept appears here in strikingly similar language to how the phrase Son of Man functions in the New Testament Gospels, and scholars have spent decades debating exactly how these traditions relate to one another. What's notable is that near the very end of this section, in chapters 70 and 71, Enoch himself is identified with this heavenly Son of Man figure, suggesting that within this strand of Jewish thought, the righteous patriarch who never died was believed to have been transformed into a supreme angelic or messianic being in heaven. This idea gets developed much further in a separate, later text called Third Enoch, written centuries afterward in a Jewish mystical tradition, where Enoch becomes the angel Metatron, described as the lesser YHWH, a being who sits on a throne near God's own throne and serves as a scribe recording the deeds of humanity. It's important to be clear that Third Enoch is a distinct work from a much later period, part of early medieval Jewish mysticism, not part of the ancient Ethiopic Enoch collection, but it shows how far this original character's mythology continued to expand across the centuries. The third section of the book, sometimes called the Astronomical Book or the Book of the Heavenly Luminaries, is one of the oldest parts of the whole collection and reads completely differently from the rest. It's less a vision of angels and thrones and more a technical treatise describing the movements of the sun and moon, the gates through which they rise and set, and the mechanics of a 364-day solar calendar. This calendar system matches what we know was used by the community that preserved the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it stood in direct tension with the lunar calendar used in mainstream Jewish practice at the time. Whoever compiled this section wasn't just telling a religious story, they were making an argument about how time itself should be measured and how religious festivals should be scheduled, a dispute that had real consequences for how a community organized its entire calendar of worship. The fourth section, called the Book of Dream Visions, contains an allegorical retelling of the entire history of Israel using symbolic animals, sheep representing the Israelites, wild beasts representing their oppressors, and it culminates in a vision of a coming judgment and a new, perfected structure descending in place of the old temple. The fifth and final section, called the Epistle of Enoch, functions as a closing moral exhortation, contrasting the fate of the righteous, who are promised joy and vindication, with the fate of sinners, particularly the wealthy and powerful, who built their comfort on the exploitation of others, who are promised a reckoning they cannot escape. Taken together, these 5 sections tell you what the Book of Enoch actually is. Not a hidden manual revealing God's origin or appearance, but a sprawling work of Jewish apocalyptic theology, wrestling with the problem of evil, the mechanics of the cosmos, the fate of the dead, and the justice of God, using the figure of a man who never died as its narrator and guide. Its real power lies in how directly it confronts the question of where evil in the world comes from, instead of locating the root of human suffering purely in human choice. As much of the rest of the Hebrew Bible tends to do, the Book of Enoch places a portion of the blame on a cosmic betrayal, angelic beings who abandoned their proper place, and corrupted creation by teaching humanity things it wasn't ready to handle. That's a genuinely distinctive theological move, and it's one reason this book had such outsized influence on later apocalyptic and mystical thought, even after it stopped being copied and read in most of the ancient world. So how does a book this influential just disappear? The answer lies in the complicated, contested history of what counted as scripture in the earliest centuries of Judaism and Christianity. The Book of Enoch was never accepted into the canon of the Hebrew Bible by the rabbis who shaped normative Judaism after the destruction of the Second Temple. Its teachings about fallen angels, cosmic hierarchies, and a heavenly Son of Man figure sat uneasily with the direction Rabbinic Judaism was heading. But it clearly wasn't ignored either. It was read, copied and taken seriously enough at Qumran that 11 separate manuscripts of it turned up in those caves, and it was popular enough among early Christian writers that it left fingerprints across the New Testament. The clearest evidence of that influence sits in plain sight in the small New Testament letter of Jude, traditionally attributed to a brother of Jesus, which directly quotes Enoch by name, citing a prophecy about the Lord coming with 10,000s of his holy ones to execute judgment, language lifted almost word for word from the Book of Enoch's opening chapters. Early church figures like Tertullian treated the book with real respect, while others grew increasingly uncomfortable with it as Christian doctrine solidified, and by the 4th and 5th centuries, most churches in the Greek and Latin-speaking world had stopped copying it, and it slowly faded from circulation across most of the Christian world. Almost everywhere, that is, except one place. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, along with the Eritrean Orthodox Church, never dropped it. They preserved the Book of Enoch as fully canonical scripture, translated into Ge'ez, and copied continuously by monks and scribes for well over 1,000 years, long after it had become essentially unknown in Europe. For centuries, European scholars had only second-hand references to Enoch, quotations preserved in the writings of early church fathers, hints that a book by this name had once existed and mattered. Then, in 1773, a Scottish explorer named James Bruce, traveling through Ethiopia in search of the source of the Nile, encountered the living Ethiopian tradition and brought 3 manuscripts of the Book of Enoch back to Europe with him. It took decades for scholars to work through the Ge'ez text. In 1821, Richard Lawrence of Oxford finally produced the first English translation, and for the first time in well over a millennium, the wider world could read what generations of Ethiopian Christians had never stopped reading. That rediscovery, followed more than a century later by the confirmation from the Dead Sea Scrolls that the core of the book really did date back to the centuries before Christ, is the actual, verifiable story behind this text's return from obscurity. No conspiracy, no suppression by a shadowy institution scrubbing it from history in secret. Just the slow, uneven survival of an ancient library, preserved faithfully in one part of the world while it was gradually set aside in another. That history is genuinely fascinating on its own terms, and it raises a real and still unresolved question that scholars across 4 major religious traditions have never agreed on. Should this book be considered scripture at all? Judaism excluded it from the Hebrew Bible. Catholicism and Protestantism exclude it from their Old Testament canons, treating it instead as an important but non-canonical historical and theological document, useful for understanding the world Jesus and his earliest followers lived in, but not divinely inspired scripture in the same category as Genesis or the Psalms. Ethiopian and Eritrean Orthodox Christianity, by contrast, have always treated it as canonical and point directly to that quotation in the letter of Jude as evidence that an apostolic author himself treated Enoch's words as prophetic. 4 major traditions, 3 different conclusions, and no consensus in sight. That disagreement itself tells you something important. This isn't a settled, forgotten curiosity. It's a live question in comparative theology, and reasonable, well-informed scholars land in different places on it. In the last few decades, the Book of Enoch has found an entirely new audience outside of academic circles, and it's worth understanding why, because the reasons are as much about the internet as they are about the ancient world. As more people gained easy access to translations that used to sit only in university libraries, the book's vivid imagery of fallen angels, giants, and forbidden knowledge proved to be exactly the kind of material that spreads well online, especially once it got tangled up with modern fascination with ancient aliens and hidden history theories, where the Watchers are sometimes reinterpreted as extraterrestrial visitors rather than the angelic beings the original Jewish authors clearly intended them to be. That reinterpretation says more about contemporary pop culture than it does about the 2nd century BCE scribes who actually wrote the text, and it's part of why headlines promising secret revelations about God's true identity tend to attach themselves to this particular book. Understanding the real history, the real archaeology, and the real theology behind it is the best defense against those exaggerations. And it also happens to make for a far more interesting story. What should you actually take away from all of this? Not that a secret book was hidden from the world to conceal the truth about who made God, because the text makes no such claim and offers no such answer. What you should take away is that the Book of Enoch preserves one of the richest, strangest, and most influential windows we have into how Jewish thinkers in the centuries before and around the time of Jesus imagined the boundary between heaven and earth, the origin of evil, the architecture of the cosmos, and the terrifying, overwhelming nature of the divine throne room, a vision so powerful that it was still shaping how visionaries pictured heaven when the Book of Revelation was written more than 2 centuries later. It gives modern readers real, physically verified insight into a strand of ancient religious imagination that didn't survive in the mainstream biblical canon, but that quietly shaped the New Testament, influenced later Jewish mysticism, and was faithfully preserved as living scripture by an entire church tradition that never stopped believing it mattered. The Watchers, the Giants, the Flood as cosmic cleansing, the Archangels, each given a specific task. The Son of Man hidden until the day of judgment, the throne of crystal wreathed in fire that no living being can look upon directly. None of that needs to be exaggerated into a conspiracy to be extraordinary. It already is. If this deep dive into one of history's most fascinating lost texts kept you hooked, that's exactly the kind of story this channel exists to tell. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next hidden chapter of history we uncover. Drop a comment below and let us know what ancient mystery or forgotten text you want us to dig into next. And if you learned something new today, do us a favor and share this video with someone who loves a story the history books left out. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.